Today's horror story is written by Dark Hero. I wasn't exactly close to my grandmother, so when I heard she had passed away, I honestly didn't know what to feel. Yes, it was sad that she had died because she was my family, but she was a stranger. My grandfather had passed away a long time ago, so it was just my grandmother, mom, and uncle. I'm not sure why, but growing up, I never once saw her. I knew that she was alive because my mom would go visit her. I always saw my dad's parents, and my mom would always preach about the importance of family. Why was her mother exempt from my life? When I was around 13 years old, I stopped my mom at the door one Saturday afternoon. I knew she was going to see my grandmother, so I asked her if I could come along. I won't forget the look on her face when she turned her head towards me. My mom and I had always had a good relationship, even now, but at that moment, I saw her face with disgust and hate. I had never seen her look that way, so I instinctively took a few steps back, as if her hand would strike me. My mom saw my reaction and composed herself. After a minute or so, she finally told me something about my grandmother. Apparently, my grandmother didn't have the soundest of minds, but my mom had left it at that. I spent the next few years just going about my life without any other knowledge of her. Now I'm almost 30, and the next bit of information I had about my grandmother was her death. My mom had called me. She was crying, and I could barely understand what she was saying. After a few minutes, I finally understood that her mother, my grandmother, had passed. I was already living alone in an apartment, but I was so close by I immediately went to my mom's side. When I got to her house, I saw my uncle with her. Both of them were quietly sobbing in the kitchen. Their feelings were somewhat alien to me. I mean, I didn't know the woman, so I couldn't share in their sorrow. I just sat with them and did my best to offer whatever help I can. They decided to not have a funeral and go ahead and bury her alongside my grandfather. That was a pretty straightforward decision, but I'm sure they've been thinking about this for a while. They asked me to go to my grandmother's house to pack up her belongings while they dealt with the burial arrangements. Honestly, I was ready to do it. By going through some of her things, I could learn something about my grandmother after all this time. I agreed, and they gave me the address to the house. It was much closer than I thought it would be, only a 40-minute drive. They thanked me, and my uncle told me he would send over one of my cousins to help. So I went home, cleared my plans for the next weekend, and the next morning I headed over to the old house. It was a worn-down house. The paint all around it was gray and chipping. The grass was so tall that it was almost up to my knees, and there was trash scattered around the property. I went to the front door with a stack of cardboard boxes. I unlocked the front door and finally entered my grandmother's house. I slipped the lights on and stood there in shock at the threshold of the door, trying to take in what I was seeing. As soon as you opened the door, there was an old bookcase completely filled with stuffed animals. On the floor were even more stuffed animals. I slowly walked past the shelf to find, all down the hallway leading to the bedrooms, stuffed animals. In the kitchen, more stuffed animals. In the living room, more and more stuffed animals. I know people would collect things, but all the stuffed animals were far from even in good condition. Each plush was disgusting, old and weathered, more than the house itself. I didn't want to touch them. I was going to call my uncle and ask what was up with all this, but I remembered that they did say she wasn't all there, so I refrained. I shook my head to focus and began to look around the house a bit. Plushies aside, the rest of the home was filled with the bare minimum of furniture. I even went into the other bedrooms, and all of them were, you guessed it, had more plushies. Each room had a large pile of assorted stuffed animals in different colors, stacked atop of each other. The sheer numbers of them weren't what unsettled me. I'm sure it was just a coincidence, but in every room I entered, all their eyes were fixed upon me. Their eyes seemed so off to me. They were all hazy and cloudy. It made me feel so uncomfortable, so I decided to make a little joke about it. I was going to take a picture of a huge pile of plushies and send it to my cousins, until I saw something move in the camera. I pulled my arms down to look back at the pile. It looked unassuming. I was sure that something moved across my phone's screen. I jumped when a sudden noise came from behind me. It sounded like bones popping, like someone cracking their fingers. I went back into the hallway to look for the noise, but there was nothing. I looked down at the plushies that filled the hallway floor, and they were all face down. I was so sure that they were facing towards me when I first got there. My phone began to ring, and I lifted it out of my pocket to see my uncle was calling me. "Hello?" I uttered, still a bit shaken up from what I heard.
"Hey, so are you at the house already?"
He asked. His voice sounded a bit sad. "I just got here, actually." He paused for a moment as if trying to find the right thing to say. I broke the silence. "Hey, so about the dolls."
"Oh, right. Mom was a bit obsessed with those things. She said they had the prettiest eyes."
My uncle's voice stuck on that last word, and he paused again.
"Listen, don't worry about packing up those things,"
he suddenly said.
"Every single one of them can rot there. You hear me?"
Right. No problem," I assured him. I heard his breath. He was shaking. I asked him if everything was all right, but he just responded with a low, "Yeah," and hung up. I didn't want to waste any more time and linger here any longer, so I quickly got a stack of boxes I left near the front door. I decided to start at the bedroom at the end of the hall. I opened the door and I immediately started gagging from the sudden burst of foul air. The smell was a mix of something rotten mixed with shit and chemicals. I was actually brought to my knees from the smell, and I forced myself not to vomit. Inside the bedroom was a dirty blanket where I assumed she slept, along with a dozen small cat litter boxes. All of them were filled with excrement. Enough was enough. I didn't want to stay here any longer. My grandmother was absolutely nuts, and there was something wrong with this house. I made my way back to the front door and called my mom. I love my mom so much, and not once have I disrespected her, but as soon as she answered my call, I just couldn't hold back. "What the fuck?" I yelled into the phone. I could hear my mom holding back a cry.
She needed help,"
she said sorrowfully. I composed myself. "What was wrong with her? Do you know what this house is filled with?" I asked.
"It was that thing,"
she said with a hint of anger in her voice.
"Ever since she got that thing, she started to change."
"Yeah, there are a lot of old stuffed animals here. Is that what you mean?"
"There's one. It was really old and it looked handmade. I don't know why, but my mother said she found it outside and decided to keep it."
She took another deep breath.
She wouldn't say where she found it, but she kept it by her side. It was really old. An off-white with black beady eyes and a stitched mouth. It had no clothes, no hair, no other features really besides the fact that it was old and had the shape of a small child.
I ran through my brain trying to remember if I had seen a doll like that, but I wasn't sure if I found it yet. My mom told me that as soon as she got the thing, my grandmother started to collect stuffed animals. At first, she didn't think anything of a stuffed animal or two, but then more and more began to fill the house. My uncle was sure she was no longer there and tried to get her some help, but apparently she would have an absolute meltdown and even threatened to kill him.
We didn't know what else to do. She didn't want us, and she didn't want any help.
My mom took another deep breath.
All she wanted was that damn thing and those animals.
She began to cry. I tried to comfort her, but what she told me next made me regret ever wanting to know about my grandmother.
The reason we didn't let you see her.
She started to sob as the memories began to fill her mind.
It was after you were born, and I hoped that seeing you would bring some light back to her. I stepped away for a moment. I swear it was just a moment, and as soon as I looked back,
I was on the edge of listening to my mom tell her story. She was sobbing inconsolably at this point.
She had her fingers over your eye, and she tried to take them out.
She finally let the memory out.
She said that you had the prettiest little eyes, and that her friend wanted them too.
I felt my stomach begin to turn as I imagined an old woman with bloodied fingers over a baby's body. I took a few minutes to console my mom. I felt bad for bringing up such a terrifying memory for her. Ever since that day, my mom refused to let her see me again. But still, she took care of that crazy old woman. After she had calmed down, my mom gave me a new task. She said with a stern voice,
I don't care what's inside that house. There's nothing good inside there anymore. Find that thing, find it, and burn it.
I was surprised to hear that from her, but I understood. Whatever that thing was, they blamed it for everything that happened to their mother. I searched everywhere inside the house, even forcing myself with my shirt tied around my face into my grandmother's bedroom. But there was no trace of a small, childlike doll. I stepped into the kitchen and grabbed a handful of water from the sink to drink it. I didn't realize how long I was there until I noticed that it was now night. I couldn't find a trace of that doll and decided to get ready to leave. As I turned the faucet off, I heard a scratching noise. It was very light, but very distinct, so I followed the noise to the door leading towards the backyard. I flipped the back porch light on, and of course it didn't work. The scratching sound was coming from this door, and it was going faster. I wasn't going to open the door unless I could confirm what it was, until I heard a... I laughed to myself. Thank God, it was only a cat. I must have let the story my mom told me get to me. I opened the back door and was met with nothing but a light gust of wind. I thought the cat must have ran away or something, and that's when I saw the backyard. My grandmother's backyard was pretty spacious, and there was absolutely no grass, just mounds and mounds of dirt. Sitting atop the center of the backyard was an antique-looking stuffed doll about the size of a small child. It was just sitting there, with its stuffed arms propping itself up. It stared at me with two small black beads for eyes, and it had a mouth stitched into a smile. I stepped closer towards it and began to hear another meowing sound. Then another, then another, then a few more. My ears were filled with the screeching of countless cats. I looked down at my feet that began to sink and saw tiny bones underneath the soft dirt. Slowly, mounds of loose dirt began to rise, and I saw small cats pulling themselves from the earth. The cats were missing bits of their body, slowly decayed and rotten. There were dozens of them gathering around the doll, that thing, and every one of them were missing their eyes. They turned to look at me, and all I could do was stare into the abyss of their rotten eye sockets. I did what any sane person would do and ran. I ran back to the house. I crossed the threshold of the back door and tripped on some of those damn stuffed animals. I was on the floor, completely surrounded by them. That's when I noticed a sound coming from them. A familiar sound. A sound I had just heard. Cat meows. I stared into the eyes of each of the stuffed animals and finally realized. Their eyes were very realistic. All of the stuffed animals had the same hazy, dull cat's eyes. Was it my grandmother, or was it that thing that scooped the eyes out of those poor cats and placed them into these disgusting things? I felt a pit form in my throat, and my stomach turned as I had a thought that whatever that thing was wanted my eyes for itself. I looked through the open back door and realized that the doll was gone. I didn't waste any more time. I ran. I fucking ran through the front door and went straight to my car, and I left. I sped into the night, glancing into my rear view mirror as if something was following me. As soon as I got to my home, I received a call and a few texts from my uncle and mom, but I didn't want to answer them. I didn't want to tell them what I had experienced in that damn home. I didn't really talk to anyone for a while. My cousins ended up clearing out the place. There wasn't much to clear out, apparently. I asked if they experienced anything, but nothing. They were just met with a disgusting old house owned by a crazy lady that loved stuffed animals. A few days ago, I called one of my cousins to ask them a few questions about the house. I asked them about the backyard, to which they confirmed that there was nothing there but a grassless old backyard. Then I asked my cousins if they noticed the cat eyes on the stuffed animals, and they told me that none of the stuffed animals had eyes at all. Each stuffed animal inside that house had stuffing coming out of the areas where their eyes should be. It took me a moment until I finally asked if they had seen a doll there. They had no idea what I was talking about. After that, I was sure I had gone crazy. I finally talked to my mom about it, and she told me that she even felt crazy when she visited my grandmother. She told me that she would hear noises and footsteps other than hers and my grandmother. I spent a few days after that, just confused. I even considered seeing a shrink or something. That was until late last night, when I heard a scratching coming from outside my front door. Thank you for listening. What did you think of today's story? What's the matter? Cat got your tongue. Or fingers, I suppose. Point is, you can't blame the cats. They're missing a lot of things these days. And as always, you can handle another story, right?